Last week's parlays were ass. Get this off the screen. I can't even look at it. The safety lock does come through, as always. It consistently does, but the rest of the parlays went completely down the drain. Lock of the week streak comes to an end with Renier de Ritter. But the underdog of the week does win with Kyle Nelson, which honestly, with all those underdogs coming through on the card, if my underdog of the week didn't come through, I would have actually been pissed. So I guess I'm glad about the safety lock, but let's move on from last week. Let's start fresh. We have a new week this week. Hope you guys are doing well. Welcome to this week's prediction episode for UFC 321, Ciryl Gane versus Tom Aspinall, where I'll be breaking down and predicting every fight on the card. So let's dive into the first fight of the night. We got a new fight just recently added in. We got Quillian Salkilld versus Nasrat Haqparast. I'm gonna pick Quillian to win this fight. I think Quillian has potential to be the future of this sport. Before his last fight versus Ashmus, I was kind of still on the fence about him as a fighter. He got a quick knockout in his debut, so we didn't get to see his full arsenal. But I think he fought a tough fighter in his last fight versus Ashmus, and he was really able to show he isn't a knockout or bust type of fighter when it comes to UFC level, and he showed how well-rounded he is with his grappling, his striking, and now I'm able to believe in him more as a fighter, and I think he's going to dominate any unranked opponents. And I'm not sure if Nasrat is ranked or not, but I just think Quillian will be more well-rounded, in the grappling especially. And at the end of the day, I just think he's better and has a bigger ceiling as a fighter. I haven't done too much research on this because it just came out, this fight. But I do think Salkilld is a more well-rounded prospect. He has clean entries into the clinch and he has a composed pace to him. Nasrat, he has a sharp one too. He's got good low kicks. He's got good takedown defense, but I just think he has a lower ceiling than Salkilld. So I'm gonna pick Salkilld to win. I think he has more layers in his game, and I think he's going to be able to win more minutes of this fight. Moving on to the next fight, we got Jaqueline Amorim versus Mizuki Inoue. I'm gonna pick Jaqueline Amorim to win this fight, but for me, this might be a trap, when it comes to betting, because at first I thought it was a really tough fight to call. I initially went Mizuki, but then I stopped overthinking it and I just settled with Jaqueline. I just think Jaqueline can take care of herself in the striking if she isn't able to get the takedowns. But if she does if she does get the takedowns, she will for sure win the round or find the finish, and win the fight. But the thing is, Mizuki, I like her takedown defense. I think she has great takedown defense. She's never been finished in her career. Obviously, she's not fighting high level opposition, but she's been looking good defending takedowns, staying on the outside. And I think Jaqueline has looked even better, however. That's why I'm picking her to win the fight. So I'm going to go with Jaqueline. I think she will be able to handle the striking and the takedown defense of Mizuki, and I'm going to trust her cardio is good enough for 3 rounds if she doesn't find the finish, because right now Jaqueline is on a roll, 4 finishes in a row, 10 wins overall, all by finishes, specifically submissions. Her ground game is so slick, and she just always manages to find the submission. But the thing is, Mizuki has never been finished. She has great takedown defense, good cardio, and she's a great striker. Jaqueline's cardio has been questionable, so I think if Mizuki can keep this fight on the feet, things might get a bit interesting. And the one loss that Jaqueline had versus Sam Hughes, Jaqueline could have finished that fight, many times in the first round. She had Sam Hughes in critical positions, but Sam Hughes being so tough, never tapped out, and that pretty much gassed out the arms of Jaqueline and caused her to fatigue and lose the decision. And Jaqueline has since spoken about that and has acknowledged the fact that she needs to pace herself. She understands the game a bit more, and it was her debut. And since that fight, she's been nothing but perfect. Even got a 3rd round TKO in the fight right after her debut. And you would think with all these submissions on her record, she's a submission or bust type of fighter, but she can definitely handle herself in the striking as well. She doesn't rush in recklessly to close the distance. She knows how to manage her distance well. She usually plays it safe until she gets this fight on the ground. So on top of that, she has really nice kicks, starting leg kicks to set up her takedowns. She uses them a lot. to keep her opponents at bay. And even in the Sam Hughes fight, the one where she lost, she was active with her kicks to set up her takedowns nicely and timed her entries really smoothly. But that was before she gassed out and got out wrestled for the next 2 rounds. But ever since that fight, ever since that Sam Hughes fight, she's been so dominant because she's been able to find the finish. She's getting finishes in every fight. 4 fights after that Sam Hughes fight, and they've all been dominant finishes. You know, she's a highly decorated black belt, high submission finishing rate, and her only loss was to a tough veteran of the sport in Sam Hughes, where she almost submitted her as well. But the question is, what happens when she can't get the takedowns or can't get the finish? You know, her opponent Mizuki has never been finished. Mizuki has great fluid footwork. It's hard to land on her. It's hard to land a strike on her. You know, she knows how to hit and not get hit. Has a nice stick and move style on the feet, and I think her striking might even be better than Jaqueline's. You know, she's quick and fluid in her strikes. I just think Jaqueline might have a hard time getting a hold of her, you know. And Mizuki fights safe. She has quick hands. She has quick movements as well. You know, she's sharp in her movement, and it's like there's no wasted energy in what she does. And it all looks really fluid when she's moving around the octagon. You know, she has great instincts, great takedown defense, good knees in the clinch, and she can be held against the cage, but she usually reverses positions. You know, Mizuki Inoue, she's 2-1 in the UFC. So not as dominant as Jaqueline because she isn't finishing her UFC fights like Jaqueline. And while both have looked good, Jaqueline has looked good against better level competition, and she's the more dominant one, actually finishing her fights, fighting higher level competition. So I have to side with her. So Jaqueline, she's a finisher, but you know, Mizuki, she's never been finished. And if you're gonna have a hard time getting takedowns on a fighter with good takedown defense and might have better striking than you, we might see a fight where Mizuki is outclassing her on the feet and keeping this fight where she wants it, on the feet. You know, Mizuki's only loss in the UFC is to Amanda Lemos, who's a powerful striker, unlike Jaqueline, who isn't as dangerous on the feet as Amanda Lemos. And in Mizuki's other fights, they were all mostly striking affairs. It was good fights, but it was mostly striking, and Mizuki showed great takedown defense in that fight. So, and on top of that, Jaqueline has showed some questionable cardio issues, fatiguing when the fight goes long. If she isn't able to get the finish early on here on a fighter who's never been finished, the longer this fight goes, the more takedowns that are being defended, Jaqueline might get outworked on the feet. You know, Mizuki has some crisp boxing with good hand speed, quick combinations, and excellent distance control. You know, I think Mizuki might be able to weather an early storm, pick up the pace as the fight goes on, outstrike a fighter who's had some questionable cardio in the past. Jaqueline, she's going to come in, look to get an early takedown, but Mizuki has shown great takedown defense. So she has the potential to survive those takedowns and win the striking exchanges. But at the end of the day, Jaqueline is more proven against better competition. So as good as they both look, I have to trust Jaqueline to look better here. I'm going to say that she looks better than Mizuki in the striking because I do think she will need to strike because she might have some trouble getting this fight on the ground. But I'm staying so far away from this fight from a betting standpoint because I just think it could be a trap. But you know, you got to sign with Jaqueline in this fight because she has the submission factor in her arsenal, right? She's had better pacing lately, and I really like her entries to set up the takedowns. She sets up her entries really nicely with her kicks, her strikes to set up the takedowns, you know. While Mizuki does have slick footwork and good boxing and stubborn takedown defense, and she's hard to finish, I just think Amorim will be able to edge the striking spots and threaten enough grappling to bank rounds, you know. This was the longest prediction or breakdown I've ever had, like ever probably, but the side is going to be Jaqueline. Moving on to our next fight. Azat Maksum versus Mitch Raposo. The pick is Azat Maksum all day here. You know, I'm gonna say Azat just outstrikes him on the feet. Maybe gets his own takedowns in this fight, while Mitch tries to get the takedowns, but he just gets reversed. You know. So yeah, Azat in his debut, you know, Azat fought Tyson Nam, I believe it was, and Nam was able to defend 9 out of 11 of Azat's takedown attempts in a close fight. And Tyson Nam, he isn't really that good. Then in Azat's next fight, he gets outstruck by Charles Johnson and gets his takedown stuff there. And in his last fight, in most recent one, he got outclassed on the feet by Tagir Ulanbekov. You know, the Tagir Ulanbekov and the Charles Johnson losses are forgivable because those are elite fighters. But barely scrapping by Tyson Nam shows that he may not be ready for that elite level. But luckily for him, he isn't fighting anyone elite here. You know, he's fighting Mitch Raposo, who's 0-2 in the UFC. His two losses in the UFC come by split decision to pretty decent competition, but none of them should have been split decisions. You know, he clearly lost both fights, so he truly is 0-2 in the UFC. He lost to Andre Lima, which is forgivable because that's a real contender in the UFC, and also lost to Sumadarji, you know, which isn't as forgivable, but Majarji is a decent fighter. But you know, Mitch himself, he's not a bad fighter. You know, in his last fight with Sumadarji, I thought he didn't look too bad. You know, he moves around the octagon really well. He has good footwork, but sometimes that's all he does is move around, doesn't close the distance. Which can cause him to get picked apart on the outside. You know, he does, however, time his shots really well. He's got some great and powerful counters, you know, but that's only if the opponent charges in recklessly. You know, another thing he does well is timing his takedowns really well. He can get takedowns, but he can't always hold his opponents down, and that's what costed him in his last fight. You know, he got a couple takedowns on Suma Darji, but he didn't do much with them and continued to get picked apart from the outside. And I don't think he'll be able to keep Azat Maksum down on the mat if he does get some takedowns. You know, Azat can scramble really well and defend takedowns really well. Azat was defending takedowns from Tagir Ulanbekov and taking him down, which was really impressive. You know, Tagir was able to get up and tag him on the feet, but in this fight, I see Azat and Mitch looking to get their takedowns, and sometimes two wrestlers are going to turn the fight into a striking match, you know, and I just think Mitch is or Azat is the better striker. You know, the wrestling usually cancels out, and it's a matter of who can use their striking in order to implement their wrestling. And if that's the case, I think Azat has sharper striking. You know, he has more power in his shots. I think overall as a fighter, he's more well-rounded. You know, Mitch isn't as active as I'd like him to be on the outside range, and he doesn't put up enough volume, and he just doesn't do much striking from the outside. And I see him moving around, using his footwork, trying to get the takedowns, but it won't be easy getting takedowns on Azat. You know, I think Azat can reverse positions or keep it on the feet and land the better shots, just being more active in his strikes. So the pick has to be Azat Maksum. You know, I think he's going to put up a lot more volume from the outside. You know, he's scramble ready. You know, anytime Mitch will shoot for the takedowns, his scrambles are elite. And I think he has the heavier hands in this matchup. Where Mitch, he does have good footwork, good feet. He's got nice counters, and he level changes as well, but it's really low output, and he doesn't have enough top pressure to keep his opponents on the ground when he does get those takedowns, you know. So I'm picking Azat. I think his activity and his pop at range will be enough to win him this fight. And I think the wrestling is also in his favor. So the pick has to be Azat. Moving on to our next fight. Hamdy Abdelwahab versus Chris Barnett. This was actually pretty tough for me to pick, but I ended up just going with Hamdy Abdelwahab to win this fight. You know, I think Hamdy should land the better shots in this matchup, given that he will be bigger, younger. He won't have a 300-pound belly in front of him, and this fight is in Dubai, you know, so the judges will basically favor him, you know. But Hamdy, he's basically 0-3 in the UFC. You know, he got tested positive for PEDs in his first fight. He won by split decision robbery in a fight he clearly lost right after that, and most recently lost to possibly one of the worst fighters on the roster in Muhammad Usman. You know, he's not a good fighter. He's not. He can't get his takedowns going. His striking isn't good. He got outstruck by Jamal Pogues and Muhammad Usman. He doesn't have a good gas tank. He gets hit often. It's like your typical heavyweight MMA fighter, you know, but he's fighting Chris Barnett, Chris Barnett actually has some real wins in the UFC, which you can't really say the same about Hamdy, you know. But the guys that Chris is beating in the UFC, they shouldn't ever have been in the UFC in the first place. You know, they have way more UFC losses than wins. You know, Chris Barnett is mainly known for that moment where he threw the spinning wheel kick knockout, and for him to be a fat old man and pull that off, it was really impressive to see him do that. You know, clearly shows some athleticism is still left within him, but I don't think either guy is getting a finish in this matchup. I think this is going to be a sad, sloppy, fat, slow, sluggish heavyweight fight. I think Hamdy is going to be moving around the octagon better, in and out, and he's not going to be as old or out of shape as Chris Barnett. And when it comes to someone like Barnett, I think Hamdy can actually fight to a pace where he's controlling the fight, actually being able to implement his game plan, get him in the clinch at the very least or fight at range. And in his last fight, Chris Barnett got broken down so easily. He was the much shorter guy being towered over by his opponent. And I think the same thing will happen here. Hamdy is going to be much taller and will have an easy time seeing all the punches coming, and he'll have an easy time staying at range, So Hamdy is going to be the younger fighter, the longer fighter. Chris Barnett being 5'9" at heavyweight is not going to play out well for him, And I think Hamdy's going to be able to do whatever he wants, get him in the clinch. He's going to pick him apart at range, hold a steady pace. And Chris, he really does only have like that blitz knockout threat, but he's way too hittable and he has low volume. He does all these spinning kicks, but I don't think that's enough to take someone out like Hamdy, and that's saying a lot because Hamdy isn't the best fighter. So I just think Chris Barnett, he's going to be way too hittable in there. He's going to put up very low volume. He's going to be way too predictable as well. So I just think Hamdy's going to have the cleaner optics and range clinch control in a pretty messy heavyweight bout, So Hamdy's the pick. Yeah. Next fight on the card, Nathaniel Wood versus Jose Delgado. I'm going to go Jose Delgado to win this fight. This is a banger matchup. I'm going to go with the rookie here. I think Jose Delgado is going to put up the pressure on. He's going to put the pressure on, stay on that gas pedal like he always does. It puts up a serious pace in this matchup. And the fact that they're giving Jose Delgado someone as experienced as Nathaniel Wood, I feel like that says a lot about how the UFC views Jose Delgado, because the experience difference isn't even close. Nathan has 12 fights in the UFC, 9 wins. Delgado has 2 fights in the UFC, won them both by brutal knockout. So they want to see just how good Delgado is. If Jose Delgado can get a win over pretty much a veteran of this sport, he's going to skyrocket into some top level matchups. This is a huge opportunity for Delgado, and I actually feel like it's going to be a competitive fight. I like this matchup because Delgado has just been flatlining everyone he faces. So it makes sense to give him someone a bit more tested to see if he can perform like that against this level of competition. So I feel like the logical pick would be Nathaniel because he's more tested, has wins over Morgan Charrier, Andre Fili, Charles Jourdain, and we saw what Charles Jourdain just did, to Davy Grant. But this matchup is going to be mostly a striking battle. And Delgado is a dangerous striker. Delgado is going to be much bigger as well, and he knows how to use his height, using those knees up the middle, those uppercuts. And we've seen Nathan have some trouble with these taller guys. And like in his matchup with Andre Fili, Fili has the same height as Delgado, and he dropped Nathan in that fight twice. But to be fair, Nathan also dropped him as well, and Nathan, he still won that fight by being composed and manage his distance, timing his shots, and that's something Nathan has been good at. That's what he did in his last fight with Morgan Charrier. He found his rhythm, was landing the jab, sticking and moving. But the thing is with Delgado, he doesn't play that tit for tat game. You go, I go. He just presses forward with dangerous, fast, clean shots, and he will hunt you down. That's the thing about Delgado. I like what I see from him. He's long and he's dangerous, and he comes to fight. He's on a 7-fight finishing streak, 5 of them, 5-fight knockout streak. And he's aggressive. His shots are deadly accurate as well. He has brutal knees up the middle. He can fight switching from both stances. His submissions are also a threat, and just has some great finishing instincts. I'm going to say Delgado puts up a fast pace, throws accurate shots, uses his length to dictate the distance and land the more damaging shots in this matchup. Nathan does have some good counters, but I just think Jose is just such a dog, and if he gets countered, I feel he'll still keep on coming. You know, Nathan's going to have to put up a clean performance all 3 rounds, be perfect for 3 rounds straight to not get hit with anything serious. But I think Jose can land that shot that changes the trajectory of this fight into his favor, you know. But you can't sleep on Nathan Wood. He's a crafty veteran. He's got good jabs, good feints, good counters, and he can mix levels. He can change levels really well. You know, I just think Delgado's gonna be way too big, way too tall, vicious knees in the clinch, and he has vicious uppercuts. You know, he's a pressure finisher coming into this matchup with all the momentum. So I just think Delgado's size and aggressive shot selection is going to tilt the fight into his favor. He's going to have the bigger moments of this fight, you know. So pick is Jose Delgado. Next fight on the card, Abdul Kareem Selwady versus Matheus Camilo. I'm gonna pick Matheus Camilo. I know Matheus Camilo because, you know, we found out about him because he stole the opportunity to fight in the UFC from that guy in the stands who got the mic and asked Dana to fight in the UFC. The guy in the crowd how to fight Matheus, and then Matheus won by unanimous decision, and he ends up getting into UFC for his debut, you know. And then Camilo had to fight Gabe Green in his debut, and he was doing well. You know, he landed some nice shots on the feet, had some great top control in round 1, but round 2, he ended up giving his back up and got submitted via rear naked choke. But he's fighting Abdul Kareem Selwady, who also lost his debut, but he ended up getting knocked out, and he struggled with some early pressure from his opponent in the first round, but he weathered the storm and started to gain momentum in round 2. But round 3, he just instantly got knocked out, and I think Camilo can apply that same type of pressure and hurt Selwady. You know, Camilo, he's a fast, patient, and accurate striker. You know, his speed and timing will allow him to land crisp combinations. You know, he works the body and works the legs really well. He can be overwhelming, and Selwady is good in those types of firefights, you know. But Selwady, he looks more of a like a brawler than a crisp technical counter striker. You know, I think Selwady needs to land a big shot on the feet to have success here, while I think Camilo can just straight up outclass him on the feet. I see Camilo winning the striking exchanges and countering those big power shots, target Selwady's legs, you know, be patient and avoid the brawls, and he's well-rounded enough to have success on the ground as well. You know, Selwady is going to try to pressure and force a brawl, try to land that big shot, but Camilo is composed enough to handle that storm and find his counters. You know, I think both of them are dogs, but Camilo is a dog with he's a dog with good technique. You know, both of these fighters are still unproven at the UFC level, but I think Camilo has more upside. He has potential to climb the ranks being so young and coming off of a loss by pretty much making a mistake, where as Selwady comes into the UFC at 30 years old and gets knocked out. I don't see him being a high-level fighter one day. And if you're in your 30s, then this is what you have to offer in your UFC debut. So I'm going to say Camilo is more hungry to win this fight as well. You know, I just think, you know, Selwady, he has heart, but he's more of a brawler, I think. And I think his defense is leaking in the striking exchanges. So I just think Camilo's patience, his fast combinations, his body work, his reactive counters, and his competent grappling is going to allow him to land the cleaner shots here. You know, he's going to have cleaner boxing, and he's going to avoid the brawl and outclass Selwady. You know, he's going to be able to get this fight on the ground if he needs to, and I just see him having more upside overall as a fighter, you know. So pick is Camilo. Next fight on the card, Walter Walker versus Louis Sunderland. I'm going to go Walter Walker. I'm going to say Walter Walker moves around the octagon nicely, avoids the power shots of Sutherland, closes the distance, and gets another submission, you know. It's a shame that Louis didn't get to fight in Perth versus Justin Tafa. You know, I was looking forward to seeing him win as an underdog. I thought he would have beat Justin Tafa with ease, and it's crazy he was a underdog because he looks good in the regional scene. You know, he's a giant man with a crazy back muscles. From what I've seen in Louis Sutherland, he doesn't seem bad at all. You know, he takes control of the center of the octagon, seems measured in his strikes, He's never been finished by strikes or submission, has only ever lost by decision. But yeah, he has never fought UFC level competition. But when he's throwing left and right hooks at you, it's a scary sight. He holds a ton of power in his hooks. I think he definitely holds more power in this matchup, and might be the more dangerous striker. Louis has never been knocked out. And I can see Louis being measured in the first round, being patient enough to wait until the right shot presents itself, then apply pressure when he smells blood. But I don't think he will find the right shots to land on Walter Walker. Walter can move well. He's skilled enough to avoid those dangerous shots on the feet. And I think he's just a higher level than Louis overall. Louis is still unproven at the UFC level. Even though he looks good in the regional scene, performing like that against Walter Walker is a whole different level. If Louis lands, his shots will have more impact. He can move in and out because he moves well for someone his size. He's light on his feet. He has proven to have a decent gas tank, winning 2 fights by decision. And Walker also moves well, and he's a smart fighter. He also is the foot hunter. You can't let this guy get anywhere near your legs because he will trap you in a heel hook, and they are nasty heel hooks. You can see the pain in his opponent's eyes when he gets a hold of their leg. Walker has looked amazing in his recent fights. 3 heel hook victories in a row. I don't think that's ever been done before. It's really impressive things we're seeing out of him. And he's a big, strong man as well. On top of that, he's hunting for your leg. So you already know if he gets anywhere near your leg, he has the strength to pull it off. To do what he did to Kennedy and Njoku, I really didn't see that coming. He pulled it off in the first minute of the fight or something. How can I not pick this guy to win in this matchup? Fighting a UFC debut. He's a finisher. He comes to finish fights, 3 first-round finishes in a row, and I think he'll be a level above Louis here. Even if this fight stays on the feet, I don't think Walter Walker is going to be a fish out of water. He can definitely take care of himself in the striking, but once Walker closes that distance, the fight shifts completely into his favor, and you're in his realm. And I'm gonna say that Walker does close the distance, get Louis in the clinch, and throw some nasty knees up the middle, be more aggressive, and get the takedowns, and find a submission. Louis is going to be looking for that big knockout shot to land, but I think Walter knows how to evade those big power punches. He moves well evading those power punches, which pretty much neutralizes Louis' game plan. So I just think for a heavyweight, Walter Walker is really mobile. His clinch entries are high level, and he has a ruthless leg lock game. That's always in his back pocket, and so he's gonna. With Louis, he has measured striking. He has nasty hooks. He has a decent gas tank, but I just think he's unproven at the UFC level. And so I'm just gonna say that Walter Walker closes the distance and finds grappling sequences to find him that submission win. Moving on to our next fight. Ikram Aliskerov versus Young Park. I feel this is a pretty easy pick. I'm picking Ikram Aliskerov. I think Ikram might just be the better fighter in every aspect of the game. If Jung Park wants to take this to the ground, I think Ikram is good enough to defend the takedowns. If Jung Park wants to strike, I think Ikram is the better striker with much more power in his shots. We've seen Young Park get dropped in his fight with Brad Tavares. It was more of a flash knockdown, but if that's Ikram timing and landing that shot, that's going to be a whole lot more powerful. Young Park also got knocked out by Gregory Rodriguez, who's a heavy power puncher as well. And I think we most likely see Young Park go for his grappling here, using high volume of strikes to set up those takedowns. But I don't think his strikes are going to have much effect on Ikram to the point where it neutralizes his ability to defend the takedowns. Young Park isn't known for his devastating knockout power. He actually doesn't have a knockout win in the UFC, where Ikram's only 2 losses have come by knockout. He got knocked out by 2 elite level fighters. Young Park doesn't have that knockout power, and he isn't an elite level fighter like the opposition that Ikram has lost to. And all of Ikram's UFC wins have come by knockout, so it's pretty telling that he will hold the power advantage in this matchup. And technically, he will also be the better striker. His grappling is also good. He's actually a Sambo world champion, and that will be enough to allow him to dictate where this fight goes. You know, powerful striking technique and strong grappling foundation. I think he should be levels above Young Park. I can't see the pressure and relentless pace of Young Park breaking down Ikram. You know, he might put up high volume in his strikes, but it won't be enough to deter Ikram off his game plan. Like a bunch of leg kicks and then shooting for a takedown won't be enough here. I think Ikram will land a couple shots, good shots on the feet, stir the direction into his fight, stir the direction of the fight into his favor. And I think his grappling is good enough to keep it standing for the most part, you know. And I think he will be able to find a knockout shot on someone who's been knocked out before and doesn't hold any true knockout power himself, which so far is the only way we've seen Ikram lose. You know, if you don't have that knockout power, you're most likely gonna lose, right? And if you're not gonna knock him out, he's coming to knock you out. And Jung Park doesn't knock people out. Ikram knocks people out. And the only vulnerability Ikram has shown in his career is knockout power, and Young Park doesn't have knockout power. Ikram has knockout power, and Young Park gets knocked out. You know, Ikram has big power, and he has composed boxing, and he has a sambo base. I think he's going to be able to dictate the pace of this fight. Whereas Young Park, his volume into the clinch and takedowns, I don't think it'll be enough here. You know, he has a limited knockout threat, so I'm just gonna say that Ikram's able to stop the shots, stop the relentless pace of Ikram or of Young Park, and he's gonna win the stand-up exchanges, and he has the much more knockout upside potential in this matchup. I feel Ikram should win pretty convincingly here. Moving on to our next fight, Ludovic Klein versus Matheus Rebecki. I'm gonna pick Ludovic Klein to win this fight. So, fun fact, I actually picked Chris Duncan to beat Matheus Rebecki in his last fight, and I'm picking Klein to beat Rebecki here as well. I think Klein will be able to keep this fight standing and land the better shots. You know, Ludovic Klein is very composed. He doesn't rush. He's dangerous when he lands, and he has power. You know, he doesn't freak out when he is hit. He stays composed, and he was on a 7-fight unbeaten streak before his last fight with Gamrot, who was able to secure takedowns consistently on him. But in the striking, he has really nice counters. You know, he'll wait for a jab, slip, throw a right hand back. He has good fight IQ, will go for takedowns if he needs to, you know. And I do think he'll be the more dangerous striker here versus Rebecki. Excuse me. You know, in Klein's last fight with Gamrot, it was really the wrestling of Gamrot that won him that fight. Despite Klein being the more dangerous striker, you know, Gamrot was able to secure takedowns on the skilled striker of Klein. You know, I do think Klein is the better striker than Rebecki. You know, I never really rated Rebecki highly as a fighter, and while I think Klein will be the better striker, I don't think Rebecki's takedowns will be effective enough to control Klein or disrupt his striking rhythm. You know, I do think Klein will be able to maintain the danger factor throughout the fight. You know, Rebecki's striking defense isn't that good when it comes to high level strikers, and I think Klein will be able to exploit that and keep this fight standing long enough to throw those damaging shots. And you know, because Rebecki is very aggressive in the striking. He's coming up against a sharp counter striker like Klein. I feel like that could cost him here. And he's got decent takedowns when he goes for them, but he usually uses his striking to set up those takedowns. And he isn't going to Chimaev dive and drag you down. Plus, he's shown to slow down in some tough fights, and this could be one of those fights. You know, Klein has powerful striking, solid submission game as well. 8 wins by submission, 9 by knockout, and his takedown defense is strong as well. So this is going to be a dogfight. He can get hit sometimes, but I think he'll be landing the more accurate shots in Klein. You know, so I think Klein will be faster, more accurate, and have more power. And his kicks are strong as well. You know, he'll target the body and legs. He'll be able to maintain the strong defensive wrestling and won't get drawn into a brawl. You know, he needs to stay composed here, and I think he will be able to do that. Rebecki is gonna come forward and try to be aggressive with his pressure, look for takedowns, but I think Klein will be able to stay composed and maintain the better striking output. Because I just think Klein has those tight counter shots. You know, he works the body, he works the leg kicks, and he has solid defensive wrestling. Where Rebecki, he's more of a pressure boxer and wrestler. He's got aggressive entries, but he's hittable on the way in. And I think Klein will be able to land the cleaner, faster counters, and he has good enough takedown defense to keep it upright and win this fight with his striking. You know, so the pick is Ludovic Klein. Moving on to Azamat Murzakanov versus Alexander Rakic. I'm gonna pick Azamat Murzakanov to win this fight. I'm definitely going with Azamat Murzakanov to win this fight. I think he's going to close the distance and land that monstrous shot like he always does. He hurts every opponent that he faces. 5 fights in the UFC, 4 of them by knockout. He's an absolute dog. And he just knocked out Brendan Ribeiro and Alonso Menifield. Not the highest level of competition, but he's still climbing the ranks and doing what he's supposed to do to these lower level guys. Alexander Rakic is going to be his toughest test yet, right? But I wouldn't say Rakic is at that elite level. Rakic is good, but he has wins over Anthony Smith and Thiago Santos, but I feel like everyone is beating those guys nowadays. Those wins aren't truly special. Anytime Rakic gets a top level contender, he loses. He lost to Volkan Ozdemir, Jan Blachowicz, Yuri Prohaskov, Magomed Ankalaev. So I don't think he's really beat anyone that's truly elite level. It just seems like we haven't. It just seems like we've seen the ceiling of Rakic. We've seen everything he has to offer, and he hasn't quite been able to break through into that top level contender spot. And at this point in his career, on the 3-fight losing streak to really good competition, I feel like Azamat being on the uphill trend in his career, carrying that undefeated momentum, climbing the ranks, he's coming to steamroll this guy. I don't see Rakic being the guy to take his undefeated streak away from him, or Rakic being the guy to stop the Azamat train. Rakic has some thudding leg kicks for sure. He uses them well to keep his opponents off of him. And in his fight with Yuri Prohaskov, Rakic showed that he does have those terrifying leg kicks. Yuri got hit with a good amount of those leg kicks in the first round, but Yuri, he continued to press forward. He switched stances, and in the second round, comes out and drops Rakic. And now Rakic's he's facing a dog like Murzakanov. I feel like the constant pressure of Murzakanov is not going to be easy for Rakic to deal with. I don't see Murzakanov going away. Even after you hit him with some good, powerful leg kicks, he'll still be pressing forward and landing those big right hands on Rakic. Azamat has some bombs in his hands. Like, his power is insane. That short and wide physique he has allows him to generate so much power in his shots. Plus, ever since Rakic tore his ACL in the Jan Blachowicz fight, he hasn't won a fight. So that's worth noting. But he did look pretty good in the first round of his next fight. But I just see this mostly being a striking battle. I see Azamat landing the more devastating shots, stunning Rakic. Azamat. He has great wrestling pressure as well. He's aggressive and applies pressure while still being composed and not recklessly coming in to close the distance. So I think Azamat is going to find the shots early to get Rakic's respect and have Rakic fear the power coming back to him. Rakic might be the better technical striker. He might look more clean with his movement. I just think Azamat is skilled in being patient enough until finding the right shot to land, because when he does close the distance and lands the power shot, the fight shifts entirely into his favor. And on top of that, having a strong wrestling base as well, I think Azamat's relentless pressure and aggressive style is going to wear down Rakic and overwhelm him. So I think the patience of Murzakanov, mixed in with his constant pressure, it's bound for him to land that nuclear right hand. Plus, he also has sneaky entries with his wrestling if he needs that as well. Rakic, he's gonna be the more technical striker, the more technical kicker as well, and he's good at managing range. But I just think Murzakanov is such a dog. He's gonna be able to close that distance and walk him down, land the momentum swinging shot to get the fight into his favor. So the pick has to be Murzakanov, in my opinion. Moving on to our next fight. Alexander Volkov versus Jaqueline Almeida. I'm going to say Jaqueline Almeida wins this fight. I'm going to say Jaqueline will be able to close the distance, get the takedowns going, and find the finish in this fight. He has heavy top control when he does implement his wrestling, and I think he can use the threat of his power in his strikes to close the distance and get this fight on the ground. I think Jaqueline is a high-level fighter. His grappling and takedowns and his grappling and takedown control are elite. The only loss he had in the UFC was to Curtis Blades, where he was dominating that fight in the whole round one. But round 2, he gets caught by an uppercut while going for a takedown and then gets knocked out. Since that fight, he's gone back to his winning ways, and getting back to back first round finishes, but he's fighting a decent opponent here, Alexander Volkov, who's really long and for this division, right? Yeah, 6'7", really long, tall striker, dangerous striker. Realistically, he should be on a 5-fight winning streak. Volkov, it says he lost his last fight, but that was one of the worst robberies I've ever seen, in my opinion. I didn't update the last 5 for him, but that L is supposed to be his most recent one, I believe. He clearly won that last fight. Even Dana White was pissed at the judges. After that, it was one of the worst robberies I've ever seen. Volkov, he's a good technical striker. He's patient. He tends to pick his shots rather than brawl. His leg kicks and body kicks are effective as well, and his striking has come along. But his biggest weakness historically has been his defensive wrestling. He also doesn't react too well when he gets cracked, and I feel like he wobbles easily when a clean shot lands. But yeah, against persistent high-level wrestlers like Curtis Blades, Volkov has struggled to keep this fight on the feet, leading to decision losses. And his striking is his bread and butter, but and his striking is his bread and butter. He's patient and picks his shots, but it almost feels too basic. Like, he can become too predictable at times. And Jailton Almeida is a powerful and aggressive grappler. He has relentless pressure, and his submissions and grappling are elite. He's really good at initiating takedowns with his double legs. He sets them up with a front kick or a jab and is able to maintain heavy top control once the fight hits the mat. And on top of that, he's a finisher lately. He used to just lay on opponents or just try to win minutes, but recently he's throwing up ground and pound, or looking for a submission, and he's coming to finish fights. The thing is, Almeida usually sets up his takedowns with his striking, and I'm not sure if he will be the better striker in this matchup. If he gets caught coming in, that could be a little interesting in this fight, because Volkov, he has a long reach standing at 6'7", as well. But will he be able to continually defend those takedowns? That's a tough ask when you're fighting Jailton, who will be relentless in the wrestling. Volkov is going to have to catch Almeida coming in to get him worried about shooting more takedowns, But I think Almeida will disrupt the striking rhythm, push the pace, grind on Volkov, get him against the fence and shoot double legs. And once he's on top of Volkov, I see him dominating the top control, staying on top, looking for a finish. And on the feet, Jailton has some power in his shots. If he lands a heavy shot on Volkov, Volkov won't react well to that. And Jailton can use his power as a threat to close the distance and get this fight on the ground, and historically Volkov has had vulnerabilities to strong grapplers, and that's exactly what Almeida is, a strong grappler. So while Volkov is tall, he has nice straight kicks up the middle, nice jabs. He needs that long space to get his game going. His takedown defense, I think it's going to be a little bit suspect coming up against a strong wrestler like Almeida, who has relentless double legs, smothering top control, and improving finishing rates, improving ground and pound and going for submissions, So I just think Jailton's going to be persistent in shooting takedowns. He's going to be dragging Volkov against the fence, closing that distance, and he's a finishing threat once he's on top. So I'm going to pick Almeida to win the fight. Moving on to our next fight. Umar Nurmagomedov versus Mario Bautista. I'm going to pick Umar Nurmagomedov to win this fight, but I'm going to say it's more competitive than what people think. Umar, I think he's going to be able to win the moments and edge this one out, but I'm not sure if it'll be domination. I can see this fight being close. I do think Umar wins, but I do have a ton of respect for Mario Bautista. I picked Mario Bautista to beat Patchy Mix because I knew Mario was a high-level fighter. On top of that, I wasn't really ever impressed with Patchy Mix before the UFC, so I knew Mario would destroy him. If you watch Mario fight, not just in the Patchy Mix fight, it's evident that he's a high-caliber fighter. He is legit, and honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if Mario were to beat Umar, but because that's just how highly I think of Mario. But I'm gonna side with Umar because it's more realistic, and I do think he's better, as a fighter, which says a lot because I look at Mario as a real high level fighter, but I do think Umar is gonna be a step above. Both are great fighters, but I think Umar is elite, especially with his grappling, and of course his highly skilled. He's highly skilled in the striking. He's super uh technical and fast on the feet. He doesn't have devastating power, but his ability to time his shots is what works really well for him. And he has got really nice speed as well. And Mario Bautista is pretty much the same. Great grappling, great striking, great timing in his shots, very active with his volume. I just think Umar is going to be a tad bit better. He'll be quicker. He'll land the better shots, be relentless with the pressure. And Mario has shown vulnerabilities to opponents being able to overwhelm and pressure him. Even though Mario has great cardio, we've seen him break and get finished twice in his UFC career, and we haven't seen that with Umar. He lost a decision to Merab, but he didn't get finished. And I'll give him the benefit of the doubt for the fight, saying he broke his hand in the first round or second round, wherever it was. Considering he doesn't break his hand, that fight could have played out much differently. And despite that injury, it was still a good fight. It's not easy to break Umar down at all. I don't have much to say about this fight because these two guys are really high level and in pretty much every aspect of the game. The only difference is I think Umar will be just a tad bit better, so that he wins more exchanges in the wrestling, more exchanges in the striking. But I can see this fight playing out closely. I think Mario is going to get hit often, and that relentless pressure of Umar has potential to overwhelm Mario and cause him to break. Because we've seen Mario be finished before, and we can't say the same thing about Umar. Both guys are going to mix it up, strike, try to wrestle. But I'm going to say Umar does it better because he's looked more dominant in his performances. Umar has that pace, that the footwork, his kicks, his chain wrestling. He's gonna win more minutes of this fight. While Mario Bautista is also a really balanced fighter with sharp timing, and he's got great scrambles, and he's got some real resistance in his defense. It's good. I'm gonna say Umar edges a close one via pressure wrestling and mixing up the strikes and the wrestling, and he's gonna have more control in the clinch and more control uh attempting to get the takedowns, because if he does get the takedowns, he will have that control, and just pushing him up against the fence at the very least, it's going to win him those minutes. So moving on. Next fight on the card, Mackenzie Dern versus Verna Jandiroba. This is more of a gut feeling, but I'm gonna pick Verna Jandiroba to win this fight. So this is actually a rematch, right? I think Verna has leveled up enough to win the fight this time. Control her for longer periods of time on the ground. Her striking, I'd say, has improved as well to hang on the feet in this matchup. But Mackenzie Dern is one of the very few people who has a win over Verna. They fought about 5 years ago in 2020, and Dern was able to dictate. She was able to win a decision victory over her. Although Dern doesn't have any knockout wins in her career, it was her striking that led the dance in the fight. Dern was able to keep a sharp jab in Verna's face, causing damage, and Verna was able to get the fight on the ground at times, but it wasn't enough to hold Dern down for long periods of time. And Dern was really successful in damaging Verna's face with her strikes. But I do think this rematch will be different. Verna is coming into this fight probably the best she's ever looked. She's coming off a 5-fight win streak, which is impressive, but specifically her last 3 fights have been the most impressive in my opinion. 3 fights ago, she beats Lupita Godinez, which is a great win, then submits Amanda Lemos by armbar. Impressive performance. And most recently beating Xiaonan Yan, which is a great win as well. Verna, she's an elite grappler and recently has been polishing up her striking as well. She's more of a well-rounded threat now, on top of having relentless pressure and top control. looking to get this fight on the mat. Though at times she can be a bit stationary in her head movement, which can cost her, getting hit. But for the most part, her success in the octagon relies heavily on her grappling. So if she isn't able to get the fight on the ground, it could be trouble for her. Just like in her loss to Carla Espinoza, Carla showed great takedown defense in that fight and was able to beat her via decision. And Dern, she also has some solid wrestling as well, decent striking that has developed as well, but she does get hit as well, versus high level strikers. But I don't think that's something that's something she needs to worry about in the matchup here, because Verna will look for takedowns for the most part, but Dern also has shown vulnerabilities to some high level wrestlers as well. Her takedown defense isn't the best versus high level wrestlers. And another thing I don't like about Dern is that sometimes she likes to get into brawls rather than having a strategic striking game plan. She can get drawn into fighting with too much emotion. Both ladies, they will be dangerous on the mat, but the recent form of Verna has been so impressive lately. I think Verna will be able to implement a grappling heavy approach, aim to smother Dern with some top pressure. And I don't think Verna will want to strike in this matchup. So she'll be looking to close the distance and grind on Dern against the fence at the very least. I think Verna is skilled enough to not get caught in any dangerous submissions Dern has to offer on the ground. Dern is going to have to keep Verna off of her for the entire fight and maintain the striking distance and pick her apart. But I can see Verna just coming forward and being relentless, in her pursuit of getting this fight on the ground. But if Verna doesn't get this fight on the ground, Dern will most likely be able to land the nicer shots on the feet, exploit the striking defense of Verna. But then again, even on the feet, Dern likes to get into brawls, and sometimes I feel like Verna is more emotionless in fighting and will stick to a smart game plan and execute it. And I do think Verna has leveled up since her last fight with Dern in this matchup. Leveled up in all parts of her game. Dern, she has the elite BJJ, and a great jab when she's able to get to keep the fight on the feet. But she can brawl at times and give minutes away, just due to not being as disciplined, And the recent form of Verna has looked much improved, As she's got a heavy top pressure game, and I think she's going to have the smarter shot selection here, So I'm gonna say Verna is the more composed fighter. She's gonna be using her wrestling, her boxing, and I think this is a rematch that she's going to be able to win again, or win this time around, right? But it really is more of a gut feeling, because if you watch the first fight, Dern pretty much put like a ton of damage on Jandiroba. But I'm gonna say Verna has improved enough in all parts of her game to win this matchup this time. Moving on to the main event of the evening, Tom Aspinall versus Ciryl Gane. I'm gonna pick Tom Aspinall. Tom Aspinall, he's basically undefeated in the UFC. He has a loss to Curtis Blades, but he popped his knee versus in that fight versus Curtis Blades, but they ran it back and Tom knocked him out in 1 minute in the second fight. So if it wasn't for that injury, he'd be undefeated in the UFC. On the other hand, Ciryl Gane should have more UFC losses than what his record shows. It says 2 losses, but in reality, there's no way he won his last fight versus Alexander Volkov. He should have 3 losses in the UFC, but he won a robbery last fight. The 2 real losses on his record, they are pretty impressive though. Only lost to Francis Ngannou and John Jones, some of the greatest heavyweight fighters ever, right? And he didn't even get knocked out. He got submitted by John Jones and went to a decision via Francis Ngannou. And the thing that scares me about this fight is that Ciryl Gane has never been knocked out, not even by Francis Ngannou. But he was able to go to a decision with Ngannou. On the other hand, Tom Aspinall has never gone to a decision. So if Tom Aspinall doesn't become the first person to knock out Ciryl Gane, he's going to have to beat him via decision. And Tom Aspinall, he's been finishing fights, all of his fights in a minute or less, right? And I don't think he'll be able to just finish Gane in a minute, right? So if the fight goes long. Can Aspinall outstrike and outclass Gane on the feet for the next 4 rounds? I do think Tom will land a big shot in the first round, and that shot will at least wobble Gane. And from that point forward, if Aspinall doesn't finish the fight right then and there, I do think Gane will be compromised enough to not finish, to not fight to the best of his ability for the rest of that fight. Tom's going to have the speed and athleticism, especially early on, darting in and out of exchanges, landing those powerful shots. Even on the ground, he's able to execute quick takedowns, and he has heavy top control. He has dangerous ground and pound and submissions as well. But if Gane can stay safe in the first round, there's still that untested cardio factor of Tom Aspinall, and Tom hasn't shown perfect striking defense either. He is hittable. I just think he hits harder when he lands. Even if Gane is able to stay safe and outstrike him, all it takes is one shot from Tom, and the fight shifts entirely into his favor. It might be tough for Tom to land that shot. Gane, he can be slick with his footwork, his movement. He has an excellent jab with some real technical striking. But when it comes to purely boxing, I think Tom has him beat there. I think Tom can outclass him in purely boxing. Gane might be the better striker or kickboxer, using his kicks and whatnot. But straight up boxing with the hands, Tom will eventually land clean, and that's gonna be the story of this fight. I think Tom is going to have that explosive blitz. He's going to have explosive blitzes throughout the fight, use his speed to close the distance, control the center of the octagon, dictate the pace, and he works the body as well. He throws shots to the body, and Tom's good at keeping you guessing, and find that shot that changes the story of this fight, right? So I don't see the footwork and technical striking of Gane being enough for someone as explosive as Tom. Gane will have to be moving and circling for 5 rounds while Tom is chasing him down pretty much the whole fight. So even if he is able to survive the early rounds, I do think eventually Tom will land that one shot that hurts Gane. And I think in 5 rounds, he will have landed that shot multiple times, enough to get Gane out of there. So I just think Tom has some of the fastest heavyweight blitzes in the division right now, like A-level boxing, and his reactions and instincts, it's high level. Plus he has constant pressure, looking for the finish. And while Gane does have good footwork, good kicks, he can move around the octagon really nicely, and he has the tools to win a decision. I just think Tom Aspinall is going to be way too explosive in his entries, finding the damaging moments over the 5 rounds. I think if he doesn't find the finish, he would have landed enough shots in this fight, enough damaging shots in this fight to win him this fight. So the pick has to be Tom Aspinall. I think he's way too good right now. But there are some factors about this fight that are still unknown, like what Tom's cardio looks like if he doesn't get the knockout, because Ciryl Gane has never been knocked out, and Tom Aspinall has never gone to a decision. So if Gane can outlast him in the first round, he could most likely win a decision. That's pretty much his best path to victory. But I'm gonna say Tom Aspinall eventually finds the shot multiple times to sway the judges, at least in his favor, if he doesn't even knock him out. And if Tom does land that shot early on, Gane's going to be compromised for the rest of the fight. So that's why I'm leaning Tom Aspinall. Despite him not going the distance, I think his shot is always going to be there. That big power shot that's always going to be there. Whereas Gane has to survive and be hunted down the whole fight. Try to win a kicking match. So I'm going to say that Tom Aspinall lands the better shots, may even get him out of there. So pick has to be Tom Aspinall. And that concludes my picks for this week's UFC cards. Let me know what you guys thought. Let me know who you are rolling with. Drop predictions down below, and let me know if you agree or disagree with my picks. I would love to know what you guys thought. As always, I hope you guys are doing well. Hope you guys have a great day. I love you guys. That's it for me. Take care. I'm out. Peace.